Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give ourselves a minute or two to let everyone come into the room, and then we will get started. So get comfortable and we'll chat soon. Okay, I have 3:30 on my computer, so we can get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar. This is our first content webinar, kind of back for the school year. We had taken the summer off at Mentoring Minds and had some big changes happen over the summer. And then we hosted a really fun virtual summit last month called Critical Thinking Live. And I so recommend that you check out our blog and all of that fabulous content if you missed Critical Thinking Live. It was an incredible event. So we are back with a few monthly webinars. And the first is we have today with Dr. Karen Hess, who is a longtime friend and partner to Mentoring Minds. And so we're so happy to have you here today, Dr. Hess, and I am going to turn it over to you to get started today. Thank you.
Thank you, and happy first day of fall to everyone, wherever you are. Glad to see you all here. In this webinar, I'm going to summarize some of the research related to cognitive rigor and deeper learning. That's what most people know me for, and I know my work has appeared in a lot of the Mentoring Minds materials with depth of knowledge. But what I find is if we don't have a common understanding, it's hard for us to work together as colleagues. So I'm going to review depth of knowledge very quickly. If you're not familiar with it, if you are, it will be a review. I'm going to talk a little bit about common misconceptions that I've heard over the years, but mostly I'm going to focus on strategies that promote rigor, thinking, and deeper learning for every student. So let's get started. I often start my workshops asking this question: how do you know when your students are doing rigorous work and thinking deeply? Rigorous work sometimes just looks like kids who are struggling, but how do you know they're doing something that's rigorous and they're thinking deeply? And in the chat, I'd like you to jot down just one thing you'd expect a student to hear or say, but do not hit send. We're going to do a wait waterfall chat. So when I say waterfall, then you hit send. But right now, I just want to give everyone time to think a little bit. It's a great strategy to use if you're doing virtual learning, and it allows everybody some think time. And waterfall. So now's your opportunity to see what other people are thinking. Look through, skim through. I'm starting to see the waterfall, and notice who's agreeing with what you said and who's adding on and expanding those ideas. Lots of good examples here. If you were in a virtual classroom, this is an opportunity for students to see, find someone who said something similar to them and maybe discuss why they said that. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. I saw a lot of things that are represented in the research. First is kids are making connections. So one of the things we know, the first signal that kids are starting to go deeper is they're relying on some prior knowledge. They're starting to relate things one to another. They're starting to build schemas. And schemas I have read about, talked about, written about for many years. If you read the work of Daniel Willingham, he talks about the importance of creating mental mind maps. So kids can start to connect their ideas. It helps them to remember and add more information as they learn. A second that I saw in some of the responses, different versions of this, it's applying what you've learned to a new situation. We call that far transfer. Near transfer is I teach you and you do it the way I taught you. That's practice, is near transfer. That's a depth of knowledge 1 or 2, when you practice it the same way. But far transfer is you extend your thinking, you try it in a new situation. Sometimes I use Grant Wiggins' analogy, it's playing the game. You've learned the skills, but now you're going to play the game. So you're going to use those skills in different ways. Tasks that provide productive struggle. So it's not, cognitive rigor doesn't really show up if you give students something that's very easy to do. Sometimes when I go into classrooms in schools, the teachers will do a review lesson. It's pretty boring for me because I don't see any struggle. I just see recall. But when I go into a classroom and a task has been given to students where they have to work a little bit to figure out how to solve it, figure out what resources they need, that's when you start to see the light bulbs going off. Sometimes it's higher order thinking. So often people will say it's when they analyze or they evaluate. These words come from Bloom's taxonomy and higher order thinking. But if I think back to some activities I did as a new first or second year teacher, I did a lot of engaging activities that were creative, for example, but my kids weren't learning deeply. So we want them to evaluate at a deeper level, analyze, take it apart at a deeper level. Collaboration, I saw several people typing versions of collaboration and discourse. When kids work together and struggle together, they talk and they hear what reasoning and thinking sounds like. That's really important because we can't expect them to know what their own reasoning is until they start to process what other people are saying. So that's really critical. And then it's questions that are going to shift the student role. It's not questions that say, what do you remember? But it's questions that say, what are your questions? It's when students ask questions of each other. And so I'll provide some examples of how that might look in your classrooms. So cognitive rigor has actually three components. First of all, it's about the content. We know that on any given day, there is going to be content that's familiar to students. Often we start a unit of study with familiar content, and then we build to more complex content. But it's also the engagement with the content. So I can give you very complex content, but not ask you to do very much with it. That's where depth of knowledge comes in. What are the tasks that you are doing with that content? And then the scope or the breadth of the activity. So I could ask an open-ended question that might take 15 minutes of class. So that would be small in scope. Or we could do a project-based learning for 2 weeks where students are doing a lot of cognitive engagement over time. So all of these components feed into the idea of rigorous cognitive rigor, rigorous thinking, and deep learning. So just a little definition here. You've also probably heard the phrase cognitive demand. When we talk about state assessments, we talk about cognitive demand, or it's a demanding task. That's about what kind of mental processing do students have to use to complete a task. Sometimes it's a one-step or a recall type of question. There's not a lot of cognitive demand. If you've memorized it, you'll probably be okay. Scaffolding is something that minimizes cognitive demand. It makes the content more accessible. And so I sometimes talk about different reasons to scaffold. Scaffolding is not the same as differentiation. Scaffolding is providing steps, just think scaffolding steps, providing steps so that every student can access the content or the task. How can you help them access a task? You might break the task down into steps, and they have to check in, maybe with peers, maybe with you before they go on to the next step. That's a good way to support executive functioning. Another example of scaffolding might be to use anchor charts or visuals that help students who are struggling maybe with learning a language. So there are different purposes to use scaffolding and different ways to do it. So I'm going to ask you in a while, but start jotting down some notes as we talk, as I talk more than you probably, I can't hear you. How are you starting to refine your thinking about rigor and depth of knowledge? And how are you thinking about ways to strategically scaffold learning to help all students access the content or the task? I can't talk about rigor without talking about scaffolding. It's an important concept. So quick review of depth of knowledge. Depth of knowledge 1 is anything you can memorize, something short, something long, something easy, something complex, but it's routine. Once you memorize it, you have it. We've all memorized things from elementary school that we probably still remember, although I would say we maybe didn't totally understand those things we memorized, but we memorized them. Depth of knowledge 2 is when you start to connect information. So when I said making connections is the beginning of moving to rigorous thinking, is when you connect information, you connect cause with effect, you compare and contrast, you summarize. You have to connect events to be able to summarize. You make observations in science and you make predictions based on those observations. So you're connecting and you're building concepts now, where with DOK1, you're not building any concepts. You are simply repeating a concept. DOK3 is called strategic thinking, and that requires a right answer, requires some reasoning. Why did you solve that problem that way? Where is your supporting evidence? Often with a depth of knowledge 3 question or task, there's more than one right answer. There's more than one possible theme in a story. There's more than one way to build a mathematical argument to support a math problem solving task. What makes the depth of knowledge answer correct is the strength of the support that proves that the answer is solid. So it's about using evidence. And DOK4 is when we process multiple sources or multiple conditions. So DOK3 would be reading one text and going deeply into one text. DOK4 would be researching a topic using multiple texts or comparing how authors use different writing strategies when they create their text. So a DOK4 always is extending your thinking because now you're processing different possibilities to come up with your approach, your solution. You draw evidence from multiple sources. When students design and conduct their own investigation or their own research project, they're at a DOK4 because they have to know how to design, they have to know how to conduct, they have to know how to use resources. So there's a lot more going on than if it's a DOK3 type of task. General rules of thumb, if there's a right answer, it's probably going to be a DOK1. I say probably because sometimes a poorly written multiple choice question might actually have 2 possible right answers, not by design. They're designed to have one right answer. DOK2 is conceptual. That's when you ask a student, how did you do that? Summarize your steps, summarize your process. And there probably is a process we've taught them. So these 2, DOK1 and DOK2, are near transfer. If there's more than one possible answer or approach, and it requires evidence, that's a 3. And we're not asking how you solved it, we're asking, why does your solution work? Can you prove this using another strategy? Often in mathematics, we ask kids to solve a problem more than one way. The first way is the proof that the second way also arrives at the same answer. You explain your thinking, and kids don't naturally know how to do this if you don't model it for them. And then DOK4 is all of the things you would do in a DOK3, but you're using multiple sources, multiple texts, multiple conditions. I often equate these to TV shows. DOK1 is like Jeopardy. You know it or you don't. DOK2 is kind of like The Price is Right. You have to have some background knowledge. You have to have familiarity with what things cost. You have to have a strategy that works. And you pretty much play the game the same way to be successful. Figure out a strategy that works for you all the time. DOK3 is like these NCIS shows where crime has been committed. They're gathering evidence to prove who committed the crime. They eliminate evidence that doesn't help, and they find the hard evidence that does. And then DOK4 is like a documentary. It's like a show like the cooking shows where you're given some ingredients and you have to create some kind of a meal without recipes. So it's more open-ended, more conditions. You only have so much time. You only have so many ingredients. Now for some common misconceptions. We've all been to amusement parks. If you're in Vermont, where I live, you've been to ski areas where you have to be a certain height to go on the ride. And there are teachers who've said, well, maybe kids can't think deeply if they're younger, or maybe all kids can't do this. But actually, that's a misconception that all kids can't think deeply or that all kids don't need scaffolding. Because any adult who's ever accomplished a complex task has had some form of scaffolding. They've worked with someone, they've revised their thinking, they've gotten feedback, they've looked at models, they've discussed it. Those are all forms of scaffolding. So if we, as adults, allow ourselves to do complex tasks with scaffolding, remember Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, discussion helps to move social interaction, helps to move us forward in our learning. Do it with others first so that you can do it independently later. That's not cheating. It's not cheating to talk about ideas before you actually put your ideas on paper. The only way kids are ever going to know how to express their own thinking is to hear multiple examples. And I'm not saying teachers doing it multiple times. I'm saying hearing many different peers expressing their thinking. Second misconception is that it's taxonomy. In other words, I've been in schools where teachers have been told you have to be at DOK 4 most of the time. That's not realistic. And that goes back to Bloom's taxonomy was intended to be a hierarchy, but a weakness of Bloom is that there are generic verbs. They're not connected to content. And so you could take any verb and put different content with it, and you would see that they're not all equal. Analyzing a text is not the same as filling in a T-chart to show how things are alike and different. So it's not just about the verb, it's about the verb and the content together and the time you're given to complete a task. Norman Webb, when he came out with his depth of knowledge model, he says it's nominative. It names how you're working with content and it's content specific. And this is why I have a reading matrix, a writing matrix, a math science matrix, a social studies, a fine arts, and so on, because the schemas we build are content specific. And this comes from cognitive science. I can learn a schema for how texts are put together. That's not going to help me figure out how to conduct a science investigation. I have to learn that schema, and I have to create the mental maps of how data relates to the variables I'm collecting data on. Depth of knowledge differentiates levels of engagement, and it suggests what tasks might look like. And one is not better than the other. What you want is balance. A good rule of thumb in a summative assessment would be that half of the score points are at DOK 2. They are conceptual. You can find the main idea of a text. You can summarize a text. You can do math word problems. You can collect data and graph that data. That's DOK 2, that's conceptual. The rest of the test should not be DOK 1. You've already covered DOK 1. You have a couple DOK 1 questions, maybe at the beginning of the assessment, and then you ask a problem-solving task. And you give more points because there are more things to score. You usually score a DOK 3 or a DOK 4 task with a scoring rubric that has multiple criteria. The next misconception is about Bloom and Webb, and they're kind of the same, and you can mush them all together. I call this the DOK wheel of misfortune because it implies that a verb is the same as a level of depth of understanding. One example I like to give is draw. You see draw in level 1 in this wheel, and Norman Webb didn't create this wheel. We don't really know where it came from. Probably that person is embarrassed and won't admit that they created this. But I could ask you to draw a circle. That's recall. I could ask you to draw a line of best fit on a scatter plot. That's more conceptual. Draw itself is not a depth of knowledge level. So it is what comes after the verb that indicates one aspect of the complexity of the task. So get rid of the wheel. I say it all the time, and yet I was doing a workshop 2 weeks ago, and there was a teacher said, I know you said to get rid of it, but I still like it. Well, I don't know why you would like something that's not as useful as it could be, but okay. So quick look at Bloom's taxonomy. Came out in 1956, but in 2001, it was changed. It was revised. It was revised with the help of Lauren Anderson, who was a student of Bloom, and David Krathwohl, who helped to develop the first taxonomy. They did some rearranging, they moved some verbs around, but it's still verbs without content. So, for example, evaluate, it says check. Well, checking something is not the same as making a judgment with criteria. Like you could check with a scoring key. That doesn't mean you're thinking at a deeper level. So what is cognitive rigor? If you looked up rigor in the dictionary, you would see strict, hard, rigid, but cognitive rigor is the opposite. It's flexible thinking. It's not about how hard something is. And a lot of times teachers just give kids more work to do and they say, well, this is rigorous. No, that's just stressful for kids. Just give them harder stuff. Most people don't like to see kids cry. And there is a breaking point if we just give kids difficult things without scaffolding. So we're thinking, what is the complexity, not the difficulty? So I might, in a kindergarten class, use a word list book. So there's no, students aren't expected to decode words, but I might ask them to find evidence in a picture that would support characteristics of the characters they see, or make predictions about what they see in the pictures. So it's still a complex task to make a prediction. It's still a complex task to make an inference, but it doesn't have to be with the most difficult text to decode when they're first learning. And while verbs might start to point out a DOK level, it's what comes after the verb that helps you determine how complex a task is going to be. This is a crazy one that I've heard from teachers in many states, is that testing companies have told them that multiple choice questions can be used to assess all DOK levels. Well, personally, I think that's kind of a dumb statement, because examples of depth of knowledge 4 are things like writing an essay that's drawing evidence from multiple texts, writing a research paper, designing a model. You can't do that with a multiple choice question. You might pick out a model. There are DOK3 multiple choice items that you will see on state assessments nowadays. You didn't used to see them. Those are the questions that might say, can you find supporting evidence for this claim? So they go back and they find evidence in the text. But the thing to remember is when a student has to formulate their thinking, they'll remember their thinking, and a teacher can uncover what they might need support with, not just if they got it right or wrong. So students do remember more if they construct their responses. And there's also research that tells us that if we overuse practice tests for state assessments, kids see the same wrong answers so often, they look familiar and they might not do as well. So we have to be careful with, are we just introducing what the test is going to be like, or are we overusing a practice test format? Misconception 6, higher order thinking is always deeper. Well, not always. Sometimes it's just fun. So analyze really means take this apart, build schema, understand how the parts work. That would be deep, but not all analysis is deep. Evaluating, a true evaluation starts with criteria. And it's not just made up criteria, anything you want to come up with. It's how would we judge a hero in a story, and then find evidence. When you teach kids to use criteria, the evidence they find will be much stronger, period. And creating is building upon what they learned when they took something apart. You took apart a text to see how, let's say a fable, what are the parts of a fable? How are fables written? And now you write your own fable. You have a schema for fable. So that's what makes it deep. And so higher order isn't always deep. We have to be careful with that. And the last misconception is because there are a lot of steps, think of long division, still not deep. That's routine. Multiple text doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go deep, or complex text. DOK2 is not just 2 steps. DOK1 is not just 1 step. DOK2 is routine, and you do it usually the same way every time, like playing The Price is Right. Reading more complex tests, but only answering surface questions is not going to be deep. It isn't until you have to answer questions about discourse style or deeper meanings like theme. DOK3 requires some open-endedness to it so that you have to interpret and then justify. So a good rule to remember, just because you're giving them a lot of hard questions, DOK1, a 1, and a 1, and a 1 is still a 1. A little quick overview of my matrix. I integrated Bloom, which is about the type of thinking, the verbs, with web. How deeply do you have to interact with it? And when I did that, and I did that because I was working with teachers who said, Karen, I think they're the same. And I knew they weren't, but I hadn't really figured out exactly how they were alike and how they were different. So I created my matrix, which you've seen in a lot of the Mentoring Minds materials over the years. They are content specific, but I integrated depth with Bloom's levels of thinking. And I did that really to prove a point that you could be at a DOK1 and be at all the levels of Bloom. You could be at a 2 and be at all the levels of Bloom. You could be a 3 or a 4. So just creating something didn't make it deep. Understanding something from multiple perspectives actually can be deep. And so we've kind of downplayed the lower order thinking, and we've said they're not as important, but they are if we know how to ask the questions. So you can download the matrices from my website. They look like this. They have little icons because they all look a lot alike, but you can see if it has books, it's for reading and listening. If you see the microscope, it's for math, science, and so on. Each one has content-specific examples and a range of possibilities because there's more than one way to address a depth of knowledge level. It's not limited to those, but I find when teachers look at the examples, it stretches their thinking. They start to use far transfer to come up with classroom ideas. And this is the most important thing. This is my second aha about depth of knowledge. The first one was that every level of Bloom wasn't necessarily at a higher level. The second is when you shift DOK levels, the student moves from taking in information to producing information, to creating information. That's where we want to be at the end of the day with kids who are preparing for the world, whether their world after high school is college or a profession. We want them to know how to produce information. A way to think about this, DOK 1 and 2 are near transfer. That's how you build your foundation. And DOK 3 and 4 are far transfer. I just read the other day about project-based learning, and a teacher in this blog post was saying, when I first started out with project-based learning, I didn't want to do direct teaching. So I threw my kids into a project that would be like a DOK 3 or 4. And he said, I soon realized that they didn't have the foundation they needed. So we need to balance the direct teaching, the facilitating of learning, with when we step back and let students start to take over. On any given project or problem-solving task, we may have to provide some background knowledge. We may have to give them a little practice of a skill that they're going to need when they complete the task. So it is about balance, where when I started teaching, it was about DOK and 1 and 2, and it's pretty boring for me and my students. So now for some strategies. You will be able to download this poster, which is 6 ways to uncover thinking. We've touched on all of them in the first chat question, and I'm going to take this poster apart for you now. So making and supporting a connection. During a lesson, not at the end of the lesson, during a lesson, use those exit cards. Stop every 10 to 15 minutes and let students solidify the learning. This is a great way to get them to solidify learning before you go on, because as a matter of fact, even the smartest learners can only hold on to 3 or 4 isolated pieces of information at any given time. And if they don't make a connection, it will be lost. So let's say you start with 5 things I know about this topic. But at the beginning of the lesson, you might say, write down one thing you know, turn to your partner, decide on one thing you know, and keep stopping during the lesson, having them add information so that by the end of a lesson, they can go back and review things that they now know. That's different from using this at the end of a lesson and saying, write down 5 things you remember because we've been doing something for a half hour or 45 minutes. So during the lesson, another is to use sketch notes. I'm very big on sketch notes. Going back to building schema, the work of Daniel Willingham, who says kids have to build mental models. As your students take notes, and I've been working with pre-K through high school teachers to show them how to have kids actually draw to help them remember. So sketch notes don't have to be beautiful drawings. There's symbolic drawings. You see a person just has a little smiley face on a triangle, but there are key words. Often there's color coding that's used. For younger students, we often maybe give them a story boxes for events, and the teacher might be doing a read aloud and the teacher stops and they draw what was happening in that part of the story. And then there's a little more reading, and then they draw again. And it helps them to recall and retell that story because they're using their drawings. It's also helpful for kids who have language delays because they don't have to worry about the words. They can just draw. The class can generate some keywords that they might put on their sketch note. Another way to visually help kids to make connections, and this also supports executive functioning. This was actually created by, I believe it was a 3rd grade teacher in New Hampshire that I was working with. I was working with all the teachers, but the idea is you co-create the anchor chart with your students. It'll be more meaningful if you do it with them, and you use color, you use visuals, and this was a problem-solving process for math. So the first thing you do is you try to understand it. How do you do that? You read it and you see the little eyes. You put brackets around the question. You look for words that are math words and keywords that you underline. You look for symbols or numbers and you circle them. So that visual, if you look at the example, because we always, in math problem solving, you always want to work through an example with students, you'll see brackets around how many kids in all, that's the question. You will see circles around 7 and 8. Those are numbers they have to remember. You see underlining for in all. So they're understanding the problem by really annotating a math problem. We annotate text, but we also have to annotate math problems in order to figure out how to figure out what their plan is. That's a second step. Once you understand it, you have a plan. Do I use an operation? Do I use equal signs? Do I use a model? Then I collect my evidence so I can show and tell you what I know. And then we do an example together. Great support, great scaffolding strategy that students can look back at and remember what the steps are, because a lot of times kids get a little mixed up with the steps. Applying learning to a new situation. So I'm going to use an example of a critical thinking module that I developed with Dr. Becky Strobaugh for Mentoring Minds. This is 5th grade science. And so if we want them to connect to their learning to a new situation, this is how the module starts. They are given an example of a science investigation, and they have to go through with their group and identify where's the testable question, where's the hypothesis, where's the equipment list. So this is reminding them of what they already know. And then step 2 is, now that you're reminded of those steps, now you're going to design your own investigation. And so you're going to have a testable question. You're going to have a plan. You're going to have to collect the data and so on. So now we want them to stretch. We're not giving them the testable question, but we've reminded them where they're stretching from. Generating questions, as I said, can shift teacher-student roles, and they should be probing questions. There should be multiple questions, not just one question. When a student answers a question, you say, well, tell me more about that. So in this visual, you see at DOK1, the teacher's questions are very narrow. I want to focus your attention. What is the student doing? Memorizing, practicing, restating. At DOK2, now I want you to make connections. So I'm asking you Why does this happen? Can you give me some examples, some non-examples? I want you to build schema. So I want you to connect, classify things, draw out some inferences. When I get to 3 and 4, though, I'm throwing the responsibility to the student. I'm saying, how do you know? Do you have any evidence? Can you find proof of that? And students are now uncovering what's important. They are self-assessing. They're reflecting on the quality of their own work. This is where students and peers can give each other feedback. And we want that. We want to have our students be capable of, my students used to come up to me and say, Mrs. Hess, is this what you want? And I turned a corner when my kids in my classes knew what good enough was, and they were able to articulate, this is why I think it's ready to be handed in. That's bar transfer. So going back to this investigation that I shared with you, now we have the critical thinking skills, adapt, collaborate, communicate, and so on. And students would check off that they did this when they did the task, and then they have to provide evidence. Rather than the teacher telling them what they did you consider different options? Well, what was your evidence? What options did you consider? So, and I will tell you, it's the high performing kids who resist these kinds of assessments at first because they're so sure that they're right. They don't want to be bothered with it. But actually, you have to kind of go with that and say, well, if you are pretty sure you know this, it ought to be pretty easy for you to provide the evidence. So that's a simple template that can be used over and over again. And in the modules that Becky and I created, we used a similar template for different tasks that students did in different content areas, where they're always seeking their own evidence. Building schema. When you analyze, you take things apart. That's the first step. You can't create before you know what you're trying to create. So you have to understand what the parts are. Even in a phys ed class, if you want kids to design a new game, they have to understand what are some of the skills they use in games that exist now, and then figure out maybe to create their new game and then evaluate if it's working well. So the evaluating comes from what criteria do we have for our game. This is an example of using a Jamboard during a virtual lesson, but it's another way to take apart the characters in a story. So each group of students has a different character. They all have the same question. How do characters' actions and decisions reveal their personalities? So one group has Harry Potter and they go through the text and they find some evidence and they are able to say, Harry did this and this is what it showed. And then another group took another character and so on. That's a way to scaffold learning, promote discourse, and then as all kids share, now we all have a better understanding of the entire text, rather than asking everybody to analyze every character or to all do it on their own. This actually comes from a website, Reading and Writing Haven. If you are an ELA teacher, you might want to subscribe to that blog. There's a lot of good materials there. We're taking the Harry Potter theme to another step. This is creating a one-pager. So this is putting together my analysis of the text read with my creative thinking, and I'm personalizing the learning now. So what's required here? Well, it looks like the author, the title of the text, some symbols. There's the little lightning bolt and the 9 3/4. But there's also what's a theme, who are the characters, what's the conflict, and what's my response to this? And then there's some other things here like a hashtag. Students really, really loved creating these one-pagers. As a matter of fact, you can do a search of visuals of one-pagers and you will find hundreds, if not thousands. I use them all the time in my workshops. And teachers will come away from the workshop saying, that's one I think my students would like. I started doing one-pagers many, many years ago, and it just started with quote the text, explain the quote, and create a visual to show what that quote means. And it can take off from there. So now, how do we structure tasks so the kids are engaging with their peers and they are assigning the roles and they are figuring out how to solve a problem? Well, one way, and you have I believe you have a link to this connected to the blog that I wrote, but this is my collaborative inquiry planning tool. And I created it when I got tired of doing all the work for my students, saying, this is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to do it. Here's what your roles are. Here's what your materials are. I thought, this is crazy. I could just tell them they have a task. And then in their own words, they write what that is. And then I'd know if they really understood what they were supposed to do. They would figure out, well, what skills are we going to have to use for this? And who's going to do what? They can't get mad at you because they're assigning their own roles. And nobody gets to be the reporter because the reporter sits around and watches everybody work. Everybody has to be involved simultaneously with a different task because that gives you individual accountability. A lot of teachers don't like to use group work because they don't know how to assess it. But if everybody has a different task, I can hold you accountable for your contribution, as well as did your group complete the project successfully. You've got to figure out what materials you need. If you forgot some important material, you don't get it because you do this before you can begin the work. So you put your plan together. You say, first we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that. It could be 3 or 4 steps. And then you decide when you've completed the task because you met the criteria. So this puts the responsibility on students. Now, would I just hand this to students? No, we would do one together. And I often use a photograph with a questions they have to answer about the photograph. What period of time do you think this was taken? And how do you know? Find sources that would support your thinking. So it might be something pretty simplistic, but they have to use some research skills. Maybe they're going to create a timeline and so on before they actually do this on their own. And on their own means together with a group. And then opportunities for productive struggle. Well, there's a lot of good ways to create tasks. I think this is a good way. It's one of my ways. I call it STARS. And S stands for scenario. Create a scenario. Describe a scenario or a situation, like planning an event, researching a topic, designing something. Maybe it's a problem they have to solve, something they heard in the news. The T is what is your task that needs to be completed? So in this task, you'll be investigating, you'll be building, you'll be whatever. Who's your audience going to be? Who are you going to share this with? What are the roles? What's your role? Maybe you're making a presentation to the school board. Maybe your role is you're going to teach other students about a topic. What resources do you need? And then how are you going to determine your success? And success criteria has to do with what content are you going to learn? What skills are you going to use? And what's your product? I hope you will notice that there are a lot of question marks in there. That's where students get to fill in some of the components. You don't have to do all the planning. You can just give them some general scenario and say, who would you like to present this to? What would you like your final product to look like? Now, you might have to do some direct teaching if they want to do a podcast and they have no idea how to do a podcast. That's where there's some direct teaching. Maybe they want to design an infographic. Again, they might need to see models of infographics to do it well. This is a planning tool that I have found to be one of the easiest way to design a problem-solving task. And you could probably go back to your classrooms, take something you're teaching and fill in just some of those boxes, and you'd have a good problem-solving performance task. So I want you to think for a minute, what are some ways that you have something you've heard that helps you to refine your thinking? And how about scaffolding? I mentioned a couple forms of scaffolding, breaking a task into parts, or using turn and talk stems to help kids get started with their thinking. You can use things like anticipation guides as a strategic scaffold to help prepare kids for the reading and then check their understanding. So if anyone would like to, everybody doesn't have to, but if you would like to, do you have a reflection you'd like to share in the chat? And I see some people are putting in some comments about the resources. So, okay, 5 W's and an H as an organizer. Visuals are important. Absolutely. I think we don't use visuals enough. They're powerful and they're personal. So you remember a visual because on your left side of your brain is the word, but on the right side of the brain is the vision of that word. And so you're stimulating more parts of the brain. Diana says her students like the turn and talks. It allows them to collaborate, and it structures the turn and talk. That doesn't have to take a lot of time. So thank you for that comment, Diana. Oh, okay. Here's a question because we're pretty close to the end here. Andrew is asking, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on addressing how or when to scaffold the materials and instruction and keep it at a high level. So I've got a couple rules of thumb. Decide why you're scaffolding. And I have 3 key purposes. If it's about executive functioning, which some kids need to keep track of the pieces, that's different from supporting the students to go deeper. And so if I want them to go deeper in a text, I might want them to read the text 3 times. I can't say read the text 3 times, but I could say skim through the text and answer this question, a surface question. Once they do that, I'm going to ask them a totally different question. So they have to go back a second time. Now I want you to go back and I want you to identify what is the first event that happened. So now I have to go back again. So a scaffold could be a series of questions that help them go deep. A scaffold could be to support executive functioning, or a scaffold could be to support language development. And so it might be visualizing what some key vocabulary mean so that they will remember those words. There are different ways to do it. So you can still keep the high level of engagement. Scaffold when you think they need a hint. Some teachers will have hint cards. They'll anticipate where kids are going to struggle and they'll say, there are hints. If you get stuck, you can come up and look at one of the cards. So hint cards are another way to say, here's a way to help you if you need it. Have students prove that their answer is solid. So thank you for that one. Here's one way that I've learned that helps math students build their mathematical proof. Divide a paper in half. On the left side, they do a step of the problem. On the right side, they have to say why they did it. Why did you do that step? What did it help you do? You do the next, you have to say, why did that help? So it builds a process for students to justify their answer. Another one that's a fun scaffolding strategy, again, I've seen it on a teaching channel video for math, but you could do it with others, is called a carousel. So every group of students gets a different problem. They'll start to work on the problem, but time is called. They move to the next group. They look at what that group has done. They critique it. If they think they're off base, they say what's not right about it and they correct it and continue to work on the new problem. Or if they think they got a good start to it, they continue to work on it. Teacher calls time like 3 times. So every group of students has to talk. Let's see, what did they do here? Do we agree that it's right or not? And the last group then has a justification. Another reflection here, it's critical that we have a shared, clear, non-negotiable definition and understanding what deeper learning is. Amen. Yes, no more random acts of rigor. We need to be consistent because kids go from one teacher to another. Rigor shouldn't change as you walk down the hall. Well, I don't know what brain gaming is. The question is, can brain gaming be a kind of scaffolding? Can someone give an example or define that? I've never heard that. Maybe I'll learn something new today. Well, until somebody tells me what it is, I just want to remind you, you can download the poster. Actually, what I sometimes do is print it on a cardstock, cut the cards apart in a classroom, and students, each group has to pick a card. So if you get this card, you have to take the problem apart. If you get this card, you have to talk about it and say, oh, here's a connection we can make. If your group gets this card, you have to ask some open-ended questions. So it's a fun way to get kids to share, think, discuss, and they're not answering the same question. Okay, so I see something in the chat. Oh, okay. So maybe I don't know if brain gaming might be like brainstorming. I don't know if that's a language issue, but you know what? You can contact me on my website. I'd be happy to interact with anybody who is on today. I often have people connect with me months later and say, I was in your webinar and I went on your website, and there are hundreds of things on my website that you can download. So lots of things there to share. And if you ever have any questions, you can contact me through my website. So Carly, do we have any other questions that we need to address, or are we
Thank
just
you,
about?
Dr. Hess. That's been wonderful, super insightful. We did not have any questions come in through the Q&A feature, and I know that you caught some of the questions here at the end. And so, yeah, I think everyone's questions are answered. We're also happy to field any questions to Dr. Hess through Mentoring Minds. So you can reply to any of the emails that you've sent. And as I've mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out an email. It should come tomorrow with a link to the recording on demand if you want to watch it again, and also a link to a few of these resources that Dr. Hess has shared today. So that'll kind of recap everything for you. And the last link I will post, she actually just has a guest blog that posted to our site on Monday, and I will drop the link here as the last thing. So if you want kind of a bit of a recap of the content here, you can check out her blog post as well. So it will also be an email tomorrow. So we'll kind of summarize everything for y'all there. And we thank you so much, Dr. Hess, for your time today. And we thank you for all of you for attending and engaging with us and having a great dialogue here. So thank you so much.
So thanks, everybody.
All right.
So,
thank you, Dr. Hess.
Yeah, there were a lot of great comments there. So thank you. It's always fun.
Absolutely.
I always feel rushed, and it's hard to just keep talking and talking. So I don't know if I went too fast. But
no, I think it was a good pace. It was a lot, but it was good stuff. So we did get a question if we can share the slides.
okay,
So
sure.
if you're
Absolutely.
I'll just kind of confirm. Okay,
Yep.
We can PDF them and again include those in the email tomorrow.
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you so much for your help. Oh, there's something else in the chat. Let's just see. Excellent training. Oh, okay. Thanks you.
Bunch of thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.